The scent hit him first, metallic, oily, faintly rotten. Malik Carter, seated in first-class seat 2A, lifted the ceramic dish the flight attendant had just served him. The presentation was elegant, even theatrical. A sprig of parsley rested on top, but nothing could mask the truth beneath. It wasn't food, it was an insult. Dog food served on white china. Malik didn't speak, he didn't shout, he didn't move. He simply stared at the tray, then at the retreating back of the man who had placed it in front of him with a smirk. 10 minutes earlier, that same man, Trent Marlowe, had confirmed Malik's dietary request with a flat "I heard." Now the message was clear: you may sit here, but you don't belong here. What Trent didn't know, what he never imagined, was that Malik Carter wasn't just another quiet black man in a designer coat. He was the architect of a global aviation ethics reform, and this flight would never land the way it took off. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The cabin hummed with the steady rhythm of altitude. Soft lighting bathed the first-class section in a golden glow, reflecting gently off champagne flutes, leather seat backs, and the polished trim of the overhead compartments. Conversations were hushed, laughter light. The flight was barely 20 minutes to Malik. The white ceramic dish sat on the pull-out table before him, its contents untouched. The pungent odor, now less masked by the rosemary garnish, curled up faintly into the air around his seat. It wasn't overpowering, just wrong, an unsettling mix of canned meat byproduct and synthetic gravy, not spoiled, just unmistakably inhuman. He didn't push the call button. He didn't even glance toward the galley curtain that separated service from sanctuary. Instead, Malik sat with quiet dignity. Legs crossed, shoulders straight, eyes gazing ahead at nothing in particular. His restraint wasn't weakness. It was precision. He had spent decades perfecting it, this ability to remain still when the world expected a scene. Every boardroom that underestimated him, every bank officer who assumed he needed a cosigner, every conference where someone asked him if he was with the catering staff. Malik had mastered the art of absorbing insult without letting it settle inside. But this time it landed differently. Not because it was the first time, no, because it was so deliberate. From the moment Trent Marlowe, the flight attendant, had paused before logging the vegetarian request, to the subtle smirk when he placed the tray down, to the unnaturally thick consistency of the entree that shimmered under the cabin lights like gelatin. This wasn't a mistake. It was performance. It was meant to humiliate. And worse, it was designed to go unnoticed by everyone else. That's what made it so dangerous. To the couple in 1B and 1C, it looked like any meal. To the businessman across the aisle, it was just another fancy dish. Even Devin, the junior attendant, hadn't seemed to notice yet. Malik could feel it, the isolation, the engineered silence. He was being tested. He leaned back slightly, exhaled through his nose, and glanced out the window. Below him, the curve of the continent shimmered with city lights, unaware that above them, a man with global influence had just been served pet food as dinner. And he chose silence. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew that sometimes silence carried more weight than outrage. Still, the scent lingered unapologetically, and every breath was a reminder that even here in seat 2A, in a $7,000 first-class cabin surrounded by linen napkins and Bordeaux, he could still be told, "You're not one of us." He reached down slowly, retrieved his leather satchel from under the seat, and unzipped it. From inside, he withdrew a small journal, black leather, aged at the corners, filled with handwritten notes from his late mentor, Dr. Henri Douglas. Malik flipped it open, scanning familiar phrases. Your silence is not surrender. It is strategy. Some men win arguments. Other men redesign the room they're argued in. The higher you rise, the more invisible your humanity becomes. Never forget it. He read those lines 3 times before closing the book. The soft chime of a crew announcement came on overhead, interrupting his thoughts. This is your captain speaking. Cruising altitude reached. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Malik almost chuckled. Relax. As if he could. The smell was still there. He turned slightly, watching Trent glide past on his way back from business class. The man didn't look at him, didn't offer a smile, just walked on, straight back, composed, convinced that he had gotten away with it. Malik didn't call after him, didn't correct him, didn't demand accountability, not yet. Instead, he placed the tray gently back on the service latch, folded his napkin with care and rested it on top. Then he closed his eyes, but his mind remained alert. Because Malik Carter hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar ethics consultancy by shouting down problems. He had done it by documenting them, by understanding how injustice camouflaged itself in politeness, by knowing when to stay still and when to move. This wasn't the end, it was the record scratch before the symphony. And in that moment of stillness, while the rest of the cabin melted into champagne and sleep, Malik made a decision not to respond emotionally, not to escalate, but to plan, strategically, surgically. Because when he moved, he would only have to do it once, and the entire airline would feel it. To the untrained eye, Malik Carter was just another elite passenger, a well-dressed black man, maybe an entrepreneur, maybe a celebrity, maybe just lucky. But to anyone who'd ever read an international aviation compliance memo in the last 5 years, the name Malik Carter wasn't casual. It was carved into the margins of legislation, whispered in regulatory reform meetings, embedded inside reform clauses across 3 continents. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a system architect. But none of that was visible at 37,000 feet. Malik sat still, hands clasped over his journal, his brow calm, but his thoughts moving with calibrated intensity. The years had taught him to weaponize invisibility, because when people dismissed him, when they saw only his skin, not his substance, he became something more dangerous than a threat. He became underestimated. Behind the sealed tray of dog food, behind the poisoned professionalism of Trent Marlowe, behind the silence of a cabin trained not to look too closely, Malik's network was already shifting into motion. He had made the call, just one, to a man who didn't need explanations, only a name: Alexander Reddick, former Air Marshal, current Director of Compliance Strategy at Zephyrs Aviation Ethics Division, a ghost in public databases but a scalpel behind closed doors. The moment Malik had pressed the red triangle on his secure app, the signal bypassed conventional network protocols. It connected directly to a private line encrypted with biometric verification in rotating nodes. Alexander didn't ask questions. He listened. And while Malik's voice remained calm, his words carried sharp intent. Name's Trent Marlowe. Flight 227, first class, intentional contamination of food tray. Passenger myself. Alexander had responded with a single word. Understood. Within 90 seconds, the machine moved. Zephyr's internal servers parsed Trent's employment record. Flagged incidents, all unresolved. One involved an elderly passenger who'd vomited after a misserved meal. Another, a diplomat who filed a sealed complaint. All 3 flights had one crew member in common, Trent Marlowe. Social media accounts long deleted were resurrected from mirror caches. An old forum post emerged. If I ever see Malik Carter in my section, I'm serving him something he won't forget. The username was cryptic, but the IP history traced back to a personal device registered to Trent's address 6 months ago. And Alexander, calm, ruthless, compressed the data, encrypted it, and delivered it back to Malik with a whisper of precision. We have the history, you have the leverage. Back on the plane, Malik received the file quietly. He didn't react. He didn't show it to anyone. Instead, he tapped the screen, locked it, and placed the phone face down on his tray. Around him, the cabin remained calm, unchanged. The hum of the engines, the muted conversation, the clinking of wine glasses. But the battlefield had already shifted. Malik remembered something his mentor once said: if they try to reduce you to a moment, remind them you're a movement. He leaned back in his seat. His eyes moved slowly, purposefully across the cabin, first to Devon, the junior attendant, then toward the galley curtain, and finally toward the cockpit door. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. This wasn't about one man, one insult, one meal. It was about how Trent had slipped through layers of oversight undetected, about the quiet corners of the system where bias hid in plain sight, about the structural rot that cloaked cruelty and policy attitude silence. And Malik, who had rebuilt entire compliance systems across Asia, Europe, and the US, knew exactly how to dismantle it. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. He only needed to document, deliver, and decide when to pull the lever. As the cabin lights dimmed again and seatbelt signs flickered off, Malik Carter closed his eyes not to sleep, but to prepare. Because the moment this plane touched the ground, everything would accelerate. He would not just hold Falconer Airlines accountable. He would cleanse it, not with revenge, but with reform, surgical, public, irrefutable, because that's what Malik Carter did. He didn't break systems, he rewrote them. The real insult wasn't on the plate, it was in the system that had let Trent Marlowe carry that plate smirk intact for 8 years with no consequence. Malik Carter didn't need to search hard for the rot. He had seen it in boardrooms dressed in mission statements, in executive lounges filled with curated diversity posters, in policies that said inclusion but meant containment. And now in seat 2A, the rot had a smell. Across the encrypted tablet in his lap, a report loaded line by line. Trent Marlowe's flight record was longer than most crew leads. Dozens of transcontinental assignments, frequent reassignment across hubs Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston. On the surface, it looked like a career of mobility. But Malik knew what that really meant. It was a shuffle pattern, the oldest trick in corporate failure management. Move the problem before it becomes a scandal. Trent had 3 logged passenger friction incidents. None had led to suspension. One was reclassified as passenger misinterpretation. Another cited inconclusive service discrepancy. The last filed under a first-class complaint had mysteriously vanished from the internal archive 2 months later. Malik flagged the entry. Alexander was already rebuilding the missing data. But what caught his attention wasn't just the events, it was the language. Phrases like sensitive guest interaction, crew member displayed emotionality under pressure, and recommended for rotation to lower visibility routes. All coded, all carefully constructed shields. Falconer Airlines, like many in its class, had learned the game. How to bury misconduct without firing. How to placate unions while avoiding lawsuits. How to perform ethics instead of practice it. And Trent wasn't an exception. He was a symptom. This was what Malik had built his legacy, fighting not individuals, but the mechanisms that allowed them to flourish. The culture of silent indulgence, of second chances for the loud, of third chances for the bitter, of fourth chances for the ones who smiled while demeaning passengers whose names they couldn't pronounce. But this time the symptom had misfired. He had targeted the wrong passenger. Malik Carter wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who authored the International Protocol for Crew De-Escalation under the Geneva Aviation Treaty Reform. He chaired over 200 policy audits in the last decade and currently sat on the Global Ethics Board overseeing 6 of Falconer's partner airlines. And now he was the case. He remembered a conversation from years ago in Nairobi. A young pilot had asked him, "How do we fix a system that was designed with silence as a feature?" Malik had replied, "By making silence expensive." That principle guided Zephyri's ethics consultancy not to make noise, but to attach cost to negligence. Cost in policy, cost in reputation, cost in shareholder faith. And tonight, Falconer was about to learn what silence had cost them. He scrolled further. Hidden within HR logs was another red flag, a catering inventory error from 2 months ago, logged under the same tray number used tonight. It had been classified as a logistics mishap. Alexander's note into the margin was concise. Same prep crew, same aircraft ID, similar smell complaint. No follow-up, same assigned lead Marlowe. Patterns? Always patterns. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but it was there, the bias filter. The way complaints from certain passengers were handled slower, investigated less thoroughly, labeled ambiguous. The way difficult to verify became the graveyard of accountability. Malik could trace it across hundreds of cases spanning airlines, continents, and cultures. The data didn't lie. When the complainant was black or brown or foreign, the threshold for credible concern rose subtly but consistently. He had presented these findings at summits, conferences, forums. He'd been applauded politely, quoted sparingly. But little had changed because systems didn't move from evidence alone. They moved when evidence collided with reputation. That's what Trent had never understood. He wasn't just rude, he wasn't just unprofessional. He was a catalyst. And now Falcon Air's quiet rot had a face. Malik leaned back, fingers tapping the screen. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't reactive. He was mapping, connecting dots the system never thought would align. From inventory lapses to disciplinary inconsistencies. From deleted logs to quietly rerouted staff. From forum posts to flight rosters. This wasn't about one meal anymore. It was about all the meals no one investigated, all the passengers dismissed, all the managers who signed off with a shrug. The rot was wide, but now it had been seen, and Malik Carter was about to make the entire airline feel it. Devin Torres had always loved the sky. He remembered being 9 years old, face pressed to the window of his grandmother's apartment in Queens, watching planes cut across the clouds like silver arrows. He never cared where they were going, only that they moved with purpose. That was what brought him to Falcon Air. Not the prestige, not the perks, but the idea that maybe somehow he could be part of something bigger, safer, purposeful. And yet tonight, standing beside the galley divider, Devin felt a knot tightening in his chest. He hadn't seen what Trent had served Mr. Carter until it was too late. He only noticed the tray delivered with performative grace, the garnish too neat, the wine too bold for a vegetarian meal. But he hadn't questioned it. Not until the smell reached him. Not until he saw the look in Malik Carter's eyes. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't outrage. It was stillness. Cold. Composed. Measured. Devin had seen anger. He'd watched passengers scream over spilled coffee, mothers weep over delayed connections, executives berate him for not chilling the glass. But this wasn't that. This was deeper, sharper. It was the look of a man cataloging everything. When Mr. Carter called him over quietly without drama, Devin had answered with a smile. It faltered the moment he saw the dish. One breath was enough. He'd smelled canned meat before. Devin grew up feeding his aunt's Rottweiler twice a day. You never forgot that scent, and no airline meal, not even the worst ones, smelled like that. The air around Malik's seat felt heavier now, not from confrontation, but from consequence. Devin stepped back from the dish, his hand brushing against the tray table edge. His throat tightened. I think you need to report this, he'd said. And the way Mr. Carter had responded, measured low, I will, had sent a chill down Devin's spine. Not because it was a threat, but because it wasn't. It was a promise. After returning to the galley, Devin stood by the sink, fingers trembling as he dried his hands on a towel for the 5th time. Trent was nowhere in sight, but the dish lingered in his mind. Why? Why would anyone serve that? He tapped the galley inventory tablet. It showed 4 remaining vegetarian meals. None of them were from Tray 3. The barcode log showed Tray 3 had been marked for non-standard intake anomaly detected at loading. His eyes narrowed. He tapped again. The barcode log matched the tray Trent had taken. Devin had been trained on meal handling protocol. He knew sealed trays had to be cross-checked. He also knew Trent had ignored the check-in scan. But that wasn't even the worst part. It was the look on Trent's face after the delivery, that crooked smile, the unspoken satisfaction. Like he had executed something that wasn't supposed to be seen or stopped. Devin swallowed hard. He had always looked up to Trent. The older attendant had been polished, confident, able to command any cabin with effortless charm. But now the charm looked brittle, performed. And behind it, Devin saw something darker. Not confidence, control. He opened the staff comms channel on the tablet, but didn't press send. Instead, he replayed what he saw, what he heard, and what he smelled. For the first time since he joined Falcon 9, Devin felt afraid. Not for himself, for the integrity of the uniform he wore. He turned toward the curtain, again peeking out toward the first-class cabin. Malik Carter hadn't moved. He sat still, eyes closed, but Devin had no illusion. The man wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. And that terrified Devin more than any angry outburst ever could, because it meant something was coming, something beyond complaint forms and HR memos, something that would force all of them to face the truth they had learned to politely ignore. He stepped into the aisle, heart pounding, a decision pressed on him like gravity. Say nothing, pretend it was a catering issue, let the moment fade, hope it gets handled quietly. Or say something, risk Trent's wrath, risk being isolated, but maybe help correct what had been wrong for too long. He took a deep breath and tapped record on the internal flight log memo app. This is Devin Torres Fade 888217, recording mid-flight log. Passenger in 2A served possible non-consumable food. Crew lead Trent Marlowe. Tray barcode mismatch. Possible intent suspected. He hit save, then flagged it to the supervisor report queue. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in his short career, Devin felt like he wasn't just part of the flight crew. He was part of the story. And that story was about to shift. The moment Devin pressed save, the system changed. It didn't sound alarms. There was no announcement. But behind the polished metal of the galley screen, behind the calm glow of the seatbelt sign, the network within Zephyr's aviation ethics division came alive. Malik Carter's encrypted file had already been compiled, but now it was being expanded. Devin's audio log was immediately ingested by the internal compliance mirror hosted in Zephyr's private cloud. Thanks to a dormant monitoring protocol Malik had helped author 5 years ago for inter-airline ethics syncing. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even invasive. It was policy buried in the fine print of every first-class operations manual under VIP incident redundancy logging. Most airlines didn't know it existed. Malik did. He'd written it. He opened his phone, entered a biometric code, and activated a feature labeled Flight Path Sync. In under 10 seconds, the system accessed cabin inventory logs, timestamp galley access, tray barcode inconsistencies, passenger interaction footage from the security lens mounted above seat 2A. There it was, Trent Marlowe leaning forward, placing the tray. A flicker of something smug crossing his face as he straightened. No words, just that smirk. The footage wouldn't break hearts, but it would crack credibility. He tapped another app, Echo Trace. This one was exclusive to Zephyr's executive team, a black site AI engine designed for scanning digital behavior trails. Alexander Reddick had already seeded it with Trent's social media post forum aliases and internal employee memos. In less than a minute, Echo Trace surfaced more. A deleted Slack thread in which Trent vented about entitled passengers who don't belong in first class. An internal request filed by Trent 2 years ago asking to be transferred off high-maintenance, diversity-sensitive routes. A comment buried in an archived employee forum. Not everyone in 2A earned it. Some just got lucky and loud. Malik's jaw didn't tighten. His pulse didn't spike. He was past anger. He was gathering. Because the power in a case like this wasn't just in what had been done. It was in who ignored it, who signed off on it, who buried the logs. He flagged each piece of data, attaching them to a chain of custody packet labeled the 227 TC intentional contamination case. By the time the plane touched down, this case would be unerasable, not just from Falcon Ayers' records, but from industry memory. Malik closed the screen and looked up. Devon stood quietly 2 rows down, pretending to check the seatbelt status light. Their eyes met for only a second. Malik gave the slightest nod. Not as a thank you, as acknowledgement, as recognition. Devon didn't smile, but he didn't look away. Back in the galley, Maurice, the senior attendant, received the flag report Devon had submitted. Unlike Trent, Maurice didn't underestimate protocols. He read the file once, then scanned the tray inventory alert. The red flag on tray 3 wasn't subtle. He tapped into the catering manifest and security scan logs. Cross-referenced the sealed meal barcode with the tray Trent had used. The match was exact. Maurice's lips thinned, his eyes darkened. But he said nothing yet. He walked back into the first-class aisle with calm, deliberate steps, pausing once beside Malik. He looked down at the untouched plate, nodded slightly, and moved on. No drama, no confrontation, just confirmation. The evidence was now triangulating. 1. Visual footage. 2. Internal crew confession. 3. Digital behavior record. 4. Barcode trace. 5. Passenger witness. 6. Executive-level surveillance access. Malik leaned back, eyes closing, his breath slow and steady. He had what he needed, but evidence alone wasn't the endgame. Deployment was. He opened one final screen, Protocol 6.2, post-flight escalation, multi-jurisdictional. There were only 3 people in Zephyr authorized to activate it. Malik was one. Alexander was another. The third was a senior investigator with dual clearance from both FAA and IATA, a man already en route to the arrival gate thanks to Malik's quiet call 15 minutes earlier. Trent didn't know. Devon didn't yet realize. And Falcon Ayers' corporate board, they were still asleep, but by sunrise this wouldn't be a food complaint. It would be a case study, a scandal. And if Malik had his way, a precedent. He clicked "Let's send" on the protocol authorization. 10 minutes later, while the rest of the cabin drifted into the illusion of luxury sleep, the foundation under Trent Marlowe's career began to crumble. Quietly, irrefutably, systematically. Because Malik Carter didn't just collect evidence. He built blueprints for dismantling rot. And now the teardown had begun. While most passengers on Flight 227 drifted into light sleep, lulled by the dimmed cabin lights and steady engine hum, Malik Carter was awake, executing. Every step had been calculated. Every click silent. He wasn't reacting. He was orchestrating. At 38,000 feet, with a glass of untouched sparkling water beside him and the offending meal tray cleared away, Malik began what he always did best, applying pressure where no one expected it without ever lifting his voice. He opened a secure document titled Incident Trigger Brief, coded Falcon. It was a standard Zephyr procedure designed for use in airborne events involving policy violations. Rarely deployed, meticulously monitored, Malik added 5 attachments. Video footage from cabin cam lens 2A, Devon Torres's crew log voice note, tray barcode discrepancy report, Trent's internal crew behavioral file, screenshots of past complaint reclassifications tied to Trent. He labeled the case Passenger Carter in-flight discrimination protocol breach. The destination Falcon Ayers board-level incident response queue. Not the public inbox, not flight operations, straight to the executive office. And he didn't sign it Malik Carter, CEO. He signed it IASC, ethics chair, is a regulatory body his firm helped establish, in which every major airline, including Falcon Air, was contractually bound to respond to within 6 hours under global aviation ethics compliance. It was a move only Malik could make, and it was already done. Meanwhile, in the cabin galley, Trent Marlowe scrolled through his phone with smug contentment. The memory of the dish, that slab of mock luxury he'd plated with surgical contempt, replayed in his mind like a private reel. He didn't worry. Why would he? No one had said anything. Malik Carter had eaten nothing, done nothing. Devin looked shaken but compliant. Maurice hadn't said a word. The man in seat 2A might have a shiny watch and expensive shoes, but Trent had seen his type before quiet corporate, at all bark and no real bite. He smirked. That's what privilege did. It made people believe they were safe. But what Trent didn't understand was this: Malik wasn't privileged. He was trained, and training was far more dangerous. In the operations center of Falcon Air's main hub, 2,300 miles away, a compliance officer named Leah Brantley rubbed her eyes and sat up straight as a Level 3 ethics alert pinged on her tablet. She'd never seen a case labeled 227 TC before. She tapped to open the file and froze. It wasn't just the contents, video logs, behavioral history. It was the source: IASC Ethics Chair. She immediately forwarded the packet to VP of Legal Operations with the note, "Immediate review. This is live. Passenger Carter is the one on board." Within 3 minutes, the internal Falcon Air emergency communications protocol was activated. Not public, not panicked, just silent and precise. They knew who Malik was. They also knew what it meant to ignore a regulatory chair's flag. And in that moment, the true power shift began. Not in the aisles, not in the cockpit, but in the places where CEOs whispered and boardrooms panicked, in emails, calls, late-night messages from investor relations teams. The dominoes were starting to lean. Back on Flight 227, Malik watched the notification flicker on his device. Packet acknowledged. Escalation Level 3 activated. Response pending. He placed the device face down, closed his eyes briefly, and exhaled. It wasn't satisfaction. It was discipline. Because the real victory wasn't that someone would be held accountable. It was that the system would have to respond. Publicly or privately, someone would have to act. A memo would need drafting. A process would require revision. A policy would be amended. And that was the real battle. Not to destroy Trent, but to make it impossible for another Trent to rise. Maurice stepped into the first-class cabin again, his expression calm, unreadable. He approached Malik and quietly said, "May I speak with you after landing, sir?" Malik opened his eyes. He replied with civility. Maurice nodded and moved on, not just as crew, but as a witness who now understood the weight of what had happened. In another part of the world, Alexander Reddick leaned back in his chair, watching Falcon Air's compliance portal ping his backup account. It had begun. He didn't smile. He didn't type. He simply picked up his phone and called a single number. "Activate Cascade." That was all he said. In 20 minutes, legal observers in 3 continents would receive anonymized versions of the Carter report, not to prosecute, to educate, to remind their clients, if you allow a uniform to hide cruelty, someone will use silence to uncover it. And Malik Carter, he sat quietly in seat 2, eyes closed, heartbeat calm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called the captain. He hadn't threatened a soul. But by the time the wheels hit the runway, he would have changed everything. The wheels hadn't even touched the tarmac when Malik Carter stood. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise, like every movement he made. The cabin lights flickered from dim amber to sterile white, signaling descent. Seatbelt signs blinked. A few passengers stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stretching necks dulled by altitude and time. Malik, still composed, adjusted the cuff of his charcoal coat, straightened his lapel, and walked calmly toward the front of the plane. The moment he pressed the call button beside the cockpit door, the hum of the cabin seemed to dip, not in sound, but in tension. A soft chime echoed inside. The door cracked open, revealing the co-pilot, mid-40s, alert, but not alarmed. He had dealt with all kinds of passengers. Late connections, anxious flyers, the occasional entitled businessman. But Malik Carter didn't look nervous. He looked inevitable. "Can I help you, sir?" the co-pilot asked, stepping partially into the doorway to maintain protocol. Malik didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled a small black leather wallet from his coat's inner lining and opened it. Inside was not an ID, it was a badge, sleek, silver, embossed with three letters in a minimalist crest, EASC. The co-pilot's eyes widened slightly. They had been trained for this. Not for arrest, not for terrorism. For compliance confrontation when someone with institutional authority raised a flag mid-flight. And Malik Carter wasn't just a flag. He was the flag. "We need to speak privately," Malik said quietly. The co-pilot stepped aside immediately. Inside, the captain looked up from his landing checklist, brows raised. "Is there a problem?" Malik didn't answer the question. He delivered a recommendation. "You have a liability in your first-class cabin. I strongly advise you address it prior to gate disembarkation." The captain stared at him for half a beat, then glanced toward the co-pilot, whose subtle nod confirmed everything. This was not a routine complaint. Malik didn't need to say more. He left the cockpit with the same stillness he had entered, but the air around him had changed. Wordless, weighty. Power had just spoken, and it hadn't shouted. In the rear galley, Maurice approached Trent with the calm of a man holding dynamite and not caring if it went off. "We need to speak," he said. Trent blinked. "About what?" Maurice leaned in, eyes flat. "About Tray 3, about what you served a VIP passenger, and about the manifest anomaly you thought no one would check." Trent opened his mouth, denial forming, but Maurice didn't give him the chance. Rear galley. Now, Trent followed, posture stiff, suddenly unsure of every step. The aisle between rows felt longer than before. Devon watched silently as they passed, his hands clenched tight by his side. Inside the rear galley, Maurice closed the metal service door behind them with a deliberate click. The hum of the cabin faded, leaving only fluorescent buzz and the weight of the truth. "Did you serve Mr. Carter something not on the official menu?" Maurice asked. Trent played dumb. "I gave him the vegetarian tray." Which one? Maurice's voice was cool steel. "Tray 3. Maurice didn't blink. He reached to the wall, tapped into the galley-mounted tablet, and pulled up the catering manifest. With 2 taps, the screen displayed the flagged entry, Tray 3. Barcode mismatch, not for human consumption. Flagged at ground load. He turned the screen toward Trent. "Dog food," Maurice said flatly, "dressed in ceramic." Trent's throat tightened. Maybe it was mislabeled. "No," Maurice cut in. "Every sealed meal is barcode tracked, scanned at loading, cross-checked by security AI. You knew exactly what you served." Trent took a step back, the bulkhead pressing against his spine. He tried again. "You don't understand. He ruined my brother's life. He bought the company my brother worked for. They fired him after that." Maurice folded his arms. "You fed him dog food because your brother lost a job." Trent's jaw clenched. "I wanted him to feel what we felt." Maurice stared, then said the words that sealed it. "You targeted a passenger with something meant to degrade him. You crossed a line. You're not dealing with crew policy anymore. You're dealing with federal aviation ethics." Trent went still, and the quiet that followed didn't feel like silence. It felt like a verdict. Malik returned to his seat unhurried. The passengers around him hadn't noticed a thing. They were still lost in their screens, their chats, their assumptions that first class meant safety from ugliness. But a storm had been confronted mid-air without turbulence. Malik sat, hands resting gently on his lap, and waited. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. But it had begun, and it would finish long after this flight ended. The wheels touched down at Ridgemont International with a soft thud, the landing gear absorbing the weight of steel gravity, and something far heavier reckoning. Inside the cabin, lights flickered to full brightness. Passengers stirred, stretching arms, gathering laptops, adjusting scarves. To most, it was just the end of a red-eye. To Malik Carter, it was the beginning of an irreversible shift. He remained seated, hands calmly folded in his lap, gaze steady on the aisle ahead. He had no interest in disembarking first. He was waiting for the collapse, and it came faster than anyone expected. Two uniformed men boarded the aircraft. No airline logos, no warm greetings, just sleek black jackets with Federal Aviation Compliance Unit insignia stitched at the shoulder. Their presence silenced the cabin. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. A child 2 rows back stopped mid-complaint, watching the men move with purpose. They didn't speak to the passengers. They didn't explain. They just walked with the kind of posture that said, "This is no longer yours to control." They stopped at the galley. Trent Marlowe, the taller of the two, said, voice even. Trent blinked, still in uniform, still trying to wear the role-like armor. "Yes, you're to disembark immediately. Certification suspended pending investigation." Trent opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Passengers craned their necks. Whispers swept like wind. Some pulled out phones, but something in the agent's presence stilled even the most curious fingers. "Contamination and unprofessional conduct involving a VIP passenger," the second agent said, as if reading from a checklist. Maurice, silent until now, stepped forward and handed over 2 items. A sealed evidence tray, a compact drive, inventory log, and galley footage, he said calmly. The officers nodded. "This is all a misunderstanding," Trent muttered, voice cracking. But no one moved to defend him. Not Devin, not Maurice, not even the captain. The aisle grew colder. His laugh from earlier, when he smirked and leaned in to deliver dinner, will be memorable now, echoed like a ghost. And then Malik stood. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't point fingers. He simply looked at Trent and said, "You served me dog food because you thought I cost your brother a job. But the board removed him after a financial audit. Negligence, not me. Look it up." Trent inhaled sharply, eyes darting. The agent stepped in, ending the moment. "You'll need to come with us." As he was escorted down the aisle, Trent passed rows of passengers who now saw him not as crew but as caution. He tried to look anywhere but at Malik, but Malik watched him, silent, immovable. And then came the final line. Next time, Malik said, "serve respect, not revenge." At Falconier's headquarters, emergency meetings convened before the plane's wheels had cooled. The incident log, now classified as Level 4, had triggered mandatory board oversight. Legal counsel, crisis comms, HR, and ethics compliance gathered in the glass-walled summit chamber. Sleep-deprived, suits wrinkled, faces pale. Malik hadn't filed a lawsuit. He hadn't posted a tweet. He hadn't given a quote. And yet the company was unraveling. Alexander Reddick's internal brief had reached 4 oversight agencies. Industry watchdogs had begun investigating other unresolved complaints tied to Trent. 3 more surfaced, all logged under ambiguous codes, all previously dismissed, all now reopened. The company's chief ethics officer looked down at the report. It wasn't just an incident. It was a pattern, a legacy of negligence, a structure that had failed not because of ignorance, but because of tolerated indifference. Back at the airport, Malik exited the plane last. No fanfare, no media. Devin waited nervously by the jet bridge. "Sir," he began, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I didn't." Malik raised a hand. "You did what mattered. You spoke up." Devin nodded, swallowing emotion he didn't know he had. He didn't cry, but something shifted. Respect, earned, silently. In a private lounge, Malik sat with Falconier's emergency liaison, an executive flown in overnight. "We deeply regret this," the man said, voice tight. "We'd like to offer restitution." Malik didn't blink. "Restitution doesn't fix culture." He leaned forward. "I want access, training logs, discipline records for the last 3 years." The man stared. That's highly irregular. Malik replied calm as ever. So is feeding dog food to a passenger. The man blinked. Is this a takeover? Malik stood adjusted his coat. No, this is a cleansing. And just like that, the collapse continued quietly, relentlessly. One flight, one insult. And now an entire airline was being rebuilt from the inside out. The Falconer boardroom had never felt so still. No phones buzzed. No secretaries knocked. No marketing VP nervously adjusted their tie to appear busy. It was the kind of silence that followed only two things in corporate America, a scandal or a funeral. And for Falconer's leadership, this felt like both. On the screen at the end of the room, a freeze frame of the tray sat suspended in sterile resolution, ceramic white faint garnish, unappetizing contents. In the lower corner, the timestamp and tray, barcode. Below it, a label Malik Carter's team had added, not an isolated incident, a reflection of structure. No one spoke, not the chief ethics officer, not the head of flight operations. Not even the interim CEO Everett Langston, appointed only 6 weeks earlier during a shareholder reshuffle largely influenced by Zephyri's growing stake. He had inherited a mess, but now that mess had a name and a legacy. Langston stood slowly. He wasn't a charismatic speaker. He didn't command attention, but he had one quality most executives lacked. He listened longer than he talked. I'm not interested in saving face, he said, his voice even. I'm interested in saving culture. He turned to the ethics division lead. I want a full review. Top down, not just Trent. I want hiring protocols, supervisor logs, complaint escalation paths, everything. Someone coughed. A PR executive shifted uncomfortably. That's a deep ask, sir. We could trigger panic. Langston didn't blink. Good, he said. Let them panic. If fear is the only thing that wakes up this system, so be it. Across the room, a young compliance officer named Darius cleared his throat. There's a dormant policy, he said carefully. Written 2 years ago under audit recommendations. Never enforced. He tapped on his tablet. The screen changed. A bold headline appeared: Carter Standard. Mandatory ethics review for crew with multiple complaints. Langston read it once, then again. He nodded. We enforce it. Now. Meanwhile, Malik Carter walked the corridors of Zephyri's executive floor in silence. He hadn't made a single public statement. He hadn't responded to the dozen press requests that landed in his assistant's inbox. He hadn't posted on social media. He didn't need to. His silence was already making noise. In his office, a low chime sounded, an internal memo marked actioned. He tapped to open it. Falconer had confirmed. Full suspension of Trent Marlowe's credentials across all partner networks. Internal investigation reopened on 3 other unresolved meal complaints, one involving a retired diplomat, another tied to a disabled passenger. All frontline crew to undergo mandatory retraining under Zephyri's aviation ethics model within 90 days. Malik didn't smile, but there was stillness in his eyes, the kind that came only when systems once rigid and untouchable began to shift. He tapped another window, Falconer's training archive. The files were outdated. PowerPoint scripted videos, empty slogans. He made a note: replace all with case study-based modules. Begin with flight 227. Then he added one more line: no names. Let behavior speak louder. At Falconer's main training center, Devin stood in front of a whiteboard. His uniform was crisper now. A new badge had been issued, not for rank, for role. Ethics liaison, internal conduct oversight. He had been promoted, not because he spoke out, but because he stayed. Because when he saw the system fail, he didn't run. He pressed record. The classroom of new recruits, young, alert, and noticeably more diverse, watched as he played the first module. It didn't open with a logo or a mission statement or a glossy slogan. It opened with silence, a still image, a tray, a look, then a quote faded in, "We don't fight the system by shouting. We show it what it should be." The room stayed quiet, not empty, intentional. On the other side of the country, Malik entered a private room inside the Aviation Reform Summit. He didn't walk onto the main stage. He didn't ask to speak. He simply sat in the back row, watching. On stage, another executive from a rival airline cited the Carter Framework, a now widely circulated approach to handling in-flight ethics violations. He showed statistics: crew misconduct down 38%, passenger confidence up 22%. Whistleblower reports increased proof not of failure but of trust. And we owe this, the speaker said, to one man who never raised his voice, who responded to hate not with fire but with structure. No applause followed, just a quiet nod from Malik in the back row. Real change had begun, not with outrage, but with architecture, with codes, with people like Devon stepping up, and systems finally stepping aside. Within 72 hours of Flight 227's landing, the foundations of Falcon Air began to shift in measurable, irreversible ways. Emails that had sat unread for months were now flagged urgent. Meeting rooms once reserved for sponsorship discussions now hosted emergency ethics reviews. And career paths that once felt invincible, like Trent Marlowe's, vanished with one tap of a delete key. The first change came quietly. A simple memo circulated through Falcon Air's internal portal. Subject: temporary access suspension. Employee ID 4087. As of immediate effect, all system logins associated with the above ID are revoked pending ongoing investigation. This includes all training modules, internal forums, crew scheduling, databases, and union communications platforms. No name was used, but everyone knew who it was. Trent Marlowe's footprint was erased from the digital fabric of Falcon Air in less than 10 minutes. Then came the audit orders. Everett Langston, newly installed CEO, moved fast, not for optics, but for containment. He authorized an independent team to cross-reference crew behavior files against historical complaint logs from the past 5 years. The findings were stark. Out of 63 escalated passenger complaints, 19 were downgraded without documentation. 11 were redirected through informal crew resolution channels. And 4, including Trent's previous infractions, had been archived without investigation. The HR director, who oversaw those cases, submitted his resignation within the hour. 2 regional supervisors were placed on leave. One had previously flagged Trent's emotional response under pressure, but failed to report a follow-up. The other had quietly removed a catering complaint from the system, citing insufficient evidence, even though the tray barcode was never scanned at loading. But Falcon Air wasn't just losing people, it was shedding camouflage. The board convened in an emergency weekend session and voted unanimously to reactivate the dormant Carter Standard, a formalized conduct review process that had sat in policy purgatory since its drafting. Every crew member with 2 or more flagged behavior reports would now be subject to a 30-day performance observation by a compliance officer. Mandatory ethics retraining modules customized by Zephyr. A zero-tolerance clause tied to their continued employment. No appeals, no PR spin, just accountability. And then came the most significant change. Falcon Air released a brief, quiet statement, not to the press, but to their own internal employees. We failed to investigate patterns. We failed to protect our culture. That ends now. Effective immediately, all complaints, no matter who they come from or what class of ticket they hold, will be logged, tracked, and reviewed by an independent oversight team. Silence is no longer protocol. The message landed like a hammer. Inside crew lounges, it was met with mixed reactions: fear, relief, skepticism. But one thing was certain: the company would never operate the same again. Devon Torres stepped into his new office, a modest room on the 7th floor of Falcon Air's operations center. His nameplate had just been installed that morning, Devon Torres Associate Director, in-flight conduct oversight. He still wore the same uniform, but everything had changed. He opened the staff dashboard and pulled up the new live behavior tracking system. Complaints came in anonymized, time-stamped, tied to crew IDs only. As he reviewed the first set of entries, one note stood out. Crew lead made an offhand comment about people like you while serving a young black couple in business class. Devon flagged it. A week ago, that line would have disappeared into HR limbo. Now it would be reviewed by 3 ethics officers, cross-referenced with past behavior, and if necessary, escalated. He leaned back, the weight of the change heavy on his shoulders but not unwelcome. At Zephyr's headquarters, Malik Carter sat in a glass-walled room with his senior strategy team. He didn't bring up names, he brought up systems. Patterns don't hide forever, he said. They wait. And if no one documents them, they become policy by default. His head of compliance, Jordan Voss, handed him a new report. 2 additional airlines had quietly initiated internal ethics reviews based on the Falcon Air incident. One of them had already terminated a crew supervisor who'd been protected for years by a friend in upper operations. The virus of impunity was being hunted. Finally, Malik nodded once, then said, "Don't just track removals, track reforms. Show me where the walls are being rebuilt, not just knocked down." Somewhere across the city, Trent Marlowe sat in silence on the edge of his brother's couch. His phone was dark, his inbox empty, his career non-existent. He had tried in desperation to apply to 2 regional carriers under a different name. Both flagged him. One even forwarded his application to Zephyr's ethics division. He had become a warning, not a worker, and no amount of apology would change the structure he had once manipulated. He hadn't just lost a job, he had triggered a new standard. Part 11 hoàn tất đúng chức năng structural consequences. Hệ thống bị buộc phải phản ứng hành vi cũ không còn được chấp nhận và các nhân sự không thể chạm đến bắt đầu rơi rụng. In the crew lounge at Falcon Air's Ridgemont terminal, the silence was unfamiliar. It wasn't the calm before takeoff. It wasn't fatigue from a long shift. It was something deeper, a tension carved from realization. Everything had changed. The walls that once echoed with offhand comments and whispered camaraderie now carried weight. The jokes had quieted. The sideways glances stopped. People watched what they said. They watched who was listening. And more importantly, they watched who was rising. At the front of the room, standing next to a whiteboard filled with reform timelines and ethics rollout schedules, was Devon Torres. Same young man, same uniform. But now when he entered a room, people stood straighter. Not because of his rank, because of what he represented. He had been the lowest-ranking crew member on Flight 227. Now he was the face of Falcon Air's new internal oversight board, tasked with reviewing every incident flagged through the newly activated Carter Protocol. Beside him sat 3 newly appointed liaisons. One was a former flight instructor, one a compliance strategist from Zephyr, and the last, remarkably, was a former passenger who had once filed a discrimination complaint that went unanswered for 2 years. Power had shifted, not just in title, but in trust. And it hadn't come from shouting. It had come from witnessing, from documenting, from refusing to look away. Elsewhere, in a quiet suburban home on the outskirts of the city, Trent Marlowe stood at the kitchen sink staring out at a bare backyard. His phone was face down on the counter, silent for days. Rejection emails had become routine, not just from airlines, but from logistics companies, hospitality services, even private security contractors. The background flag was permanent now. He wasn't just suspended. He had become a case study. He clicked through an ethics documentary someone had sent him anonymously. The title, Power in Silence, What Flight 227 Taught Us. 10 minutes in, the screen froze on a still of him placing the tray. The camera caught the smirk, the posture, the moment he thought he had the upper hand. The narration was calm. When we assume our actions disappear behind a uniform, We forget that impact doesn't need a spotlight to leave a scar. He turned the TV off, sat down, buried his head in his hands. There would be no comeback tour. Because for once in his life, he couldn't talk his way out. There was no supervisor to protect him, no file that could be quietly deleted, no system left to exploit. The hierarchy that once cushioned him had collapsed under the weight of the truth. Back at Falconire headquarters, Everett Langston stood before the board with a new report. The header read Ethical Repositioning Initiative, Phase 2. Underneath were the names of 12 crew members reassigned, 3 terminated, and 2 promoted not for loyalty, but for courage. Devin was one of them. Another was Maurice, the senior flight attendant, who had stood his ground in the galley, who had reported truthfully without waiting to be told. Langston closed the folder. I want these names embedded into our retraining modules, he said, not because they're heroes, because they were prepared when leadership wasn't. Someone on the board asked, what about public apology? Should we make one? Langston shook his head slowly. We're not in a public phase, we're in a structural one. He turned toward the window. They don't want a press release. They want a new system. Malik Carter read the board minutes later that night from his office alone. The word reversal didn't interest him. He didn't care about optics. What mattered was momentum. He looked down at a single photo on his desk, Devin standing in front of a group of new recruits, arms folded, smiling not with pride but with purpose. Malik turned the photo over. On the back, a handwritten note. He never yelled, but the whole system heard him. He folded the note, placed it back in the drawer, and whispered, good. Now let's make it permanent. Power wasn't in who sat at the front of the plane. It was in who controlled the rules, and the rules had changed. It began in a room with no podiums, no press, no ceremony, just 12 chairs arranged in a quiet semicircle inside Falconire's Leadership Training Center. On one of those chairs sat Devin Torres, wearing the same Navy uniform he had worn on Flight 227, but now with a silver pin on his chest that simply read, Oversight, Integrity, Witness. He wasn't the youngest in the room. He was the only one who hadn't asked to be here. Across from him sat mid-level managers from route logistics, flight operations, cabin service design, and HR policy. For the first time, leadership training at Falconire wasn't being led by someone with an MBA or a motivational speaking background. It was led by a flight attendant who had once said, I think you need to report this. Devin cleared his throat and stood. We're not here to learn rules, he said. We're here to learn what silence costs. The room stayed still. Behind him, a screen displayed a quote from Malik Carter. Legacy is not built in one moment, but it can collapse in one. The first module began not with theory, but with case study. Flight 227, the boarding, the request, the tray, the smirk, the stillness. Devin played a 19-second video, Trent Marlowe delivering the tainted dish, then walking away. No sound, just body language, just truth. Then he turned to the room. What should have happened next? Silence. Then a woman from crew scheduling raised her hand. The galley manifest should have been verified. The barcode should have flagged the tray before it reached service. And if it didn't, Devin asked, then someone should have stepped in. He nodded. That someone is all of you. No applause followed, just understanding. The lesson had landed. 3 floors above, in a sleek conference room with one-way glass overlooking the hangar, Everett Langston watched the session unfold in real time on a monitor. Beside him stood Malik Carter, arms folded, gaze steady. They're listening, Langston said quietly. Malik didn't smile. Good, now make them repeat it. Langston turned hesitant. Why didn't you just take the reins? You could have bought the company. You could have forced resignations. Malik turned to face him. Because I'm not interested in puppets. I'm interested in principles. He leaned forward slightly. This isn't about leading from the top. It's about rewiring the base. Langston nodded. He understood now. Malik didn't want to own Falconire. He wanted to inoculate it. Across the industry, ripple effects followed. Two rival airlines announced early-stage partnerships with Zephyr's ethics division, not because they wanted to, but because their boards insisted. The phrase Carter Standard became shorthand for compliance that couldn't be negotiated. Training schools began rewriting modules. Flight attendant academies restructured their customer interaction protocols. Pilots were now briefed not only on turbulence, but on ethical escalation chains. And in the middle of it all, Malik stayed quiet. He didn't attend the conferences. He didn't headline the panels. Instead, he sent Devon, not as a symbol, as proof that leadership wasn't about age or status. It was about clarity in moments that invited cowardice. Inside Zephyr headquarters, Malik sat across from his senior advisor, Jordan Voss. They were reviewing applications not for executive roles, but for a new leadership residency program. Only one criterion mattered. Have you ever spoken up when it wasn't safe to do so? Malik read through each submission. One from a former gate agent who had documented discriminatory boarding practices, one from a regional flight manager who had gone around her supervisor to report meal mishandling, one from a former passenger turned policy student who had tracked bias patterns in service times by seat row and race. These aren't resumes, Jordan said. Malik looked up. They're future systems. He nodded once. Admit them all. Back at Falcon Air, a new plaque was installed in the training wing. It wasn't named after Malik, or Devon, or Flight 227. It simply read, "This room exists because someone stayed quiet, then decided not to." Underneath in smaller letters, Carter Ethics Hall, estimated year one, no year listed. Because this wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning. For decades, Falcon Air's operational handbook had been a fortress, hundreds of pages thick, written in legalese, engineered to shield the company from liability more than to guide behavior. Now it was being rewritten, line by line, from the inside out, not by lawyers, by survivors. At the heart of this transformation was a new initiative, Zephyr X Falcon Air Project, Z Ethics. The mission wasn't vague, it was urgent. Redesign the culture of aviation from check-in to cockpit. Inside a converted operations center on Falcon Air's Ridgemont campus, whiteboards lined every wall. They were covered in red ink, black tape, post-its, policies, and questions. Not just what happened, but why wasn't it caught? Who knew but didn't act? What did the training not prepare them for? How do we make silence impossible? A rotating team of 27 reform architects, ethics officers, diversity, scholars, former crew members, passengers, and compliance specialists worked in shifts around the clock. And they weren't guessing. They were building off a case study no one could ignore, Flight 227. The first change bias-triggered escalation tools. Every crew member now carried a handheld device that didn't just check seating manifests. It cross-referenced behavioral flags. If a meal was swapped mid-prep without an override code, the system issued a silent compliance ping to operations. Second, transparent complaint threading. Previously, passenger complaints died in email boxes or were rerouted through vague feedback channels. Now every complaint was time-stamped, anonymized, and publicly visible on Falcon Air's internal intranet, viewable by ethics, HR, and all certified internal observers. If a case was closed, the reason had to be logged. If the reason was insufficient, the case reopened automatically after 30 days. Third, mandatory psychological de-bias training. This wasn't a 1-hour sensitivity slideshow. It was a 21-day progressive curriculum, co-authored by Zephyr and leading behavioral science departments, complete with role reversal, immersion, biometric, empathy, feedback tracking, and real-time decision-making simulations. And it wasn't just for flight staff. It was for everyone: executives, contractors, board members, and even pilot unions. Meanwhile, Malik Carter reviewed daily reform digests from his Zephyr office. He didn't micromanage. He audited. Every Thursday, his team flagged 2 entries. One example of a broken protocol. one example of emerging excellence. Then they discuss both in his private conference room, not to assign blame, but to extract design flaws. This isn't about discipline, he said. It's about structure. Systems fail when they expect individuals to carry morality unsupported. His team nodded, taking notes not as subordinates, but as co-architects. Malik didn't want a one-time fix. He wanted an immune system, a structure that didn't just detect injustice, but rejected it reflexively. Back inside Falconer HQ, Devin Torres walked a new team of recruits through Simhall Alpha, a fully reconstructed aircraft cabin used for ethics immersion. Today's exercise scenario: discrete discrimination in premium cabin service. One trainee hesitated when asked to intervene in a passive-aggressive interaction. "What if it's not obvious?" she asked. Devin replied, "If it's quiet enough that no one sees it, it's already too loud for the person living it." The class paused. Then they rewound the scene. This time the trainee intervened, not with confrontation, with documentation. And that made all the difference. In a quiet office in D.C., an FAA official closed a briefing folder marked Falconer, Post-Crisis Integration. She turned to her colleague. "I've never seen an airline implement reform this fast." Her colleague nodded. "That's because they're not fixing reputation, they're fixing architecture." 3 months after the incident, Falconer's quarterly report showed a 19% spike in employee satisfaction, a 31% increase in whistleblower engagement, and for the first time, a measurable decline in bias-linked passenger complaints. Shareholders were skeptical until the stock held, then climbed, because it turned out integrity scales. And Malik had known it all along. He didn't need Falconer to make a public apology. He needed them to make public accountability visible from the inside. Now, every employee from the tarmac to the tower could name the day the culture shifted. It wasn't the day someone got caught. It was the day someone refused to stay silent. And it rippled across manuals, metrics, and mindsets. Not because of policy, because of purpose. For weeks, the story had lingered in quiet corners of the internet, not on the trending pages, not on celebrity timelines, but in message boards, ethics forums, in closed group discussions among crew members, frequent flyers, policy students, and equity advocates. Flight 227 wasn't a headline anymore. It was a reference point. And then almost without warning, the clip resurfaced. 19 seconds. A ceramic tray, a slight smirk, a black man seated in 2A saying nothing but showing everything. This time it wasn't just shared, it was dissected. TikTok creators analyzed body language. LinkedIn leaders posted lessons on restraint and ethical escalation. Aviation school instructors rewrote entire lectures based on the clip. And in the caption that most often accompanied the repost, he didn't yell. But the whole plane changed. The public, long cynical about airline apologies, began to ask a new kind of question. What if the system only changes when we stop demanding outrage and start demanding outcomes? What if one man staying calm did more than 1,000 angry hashtags, and that question changed everything? Journalists took notice. Major outlets picked up on the ripple effect of the Carter reforms, not because Malik gave interviews, he still declined them all, but because the data spoke louder. In a segment titled The Carter Effect, a respected news anchor opened with, "This isn't about one tray of food. It's about a power structure that cracked silently and rebuilt publicly." Falconer's new ethics dashboard, previously internal, was now published monthly. Passenger trust scores rose. Complaint resolution rates doubled. Crew satisfaction jumped 18%. Other airlines scrambled to catch up. Aviation blogs, once skeptical of corporate compliance, now posted headlines like, "From liability to leadership, Falconer becomes unexpected." Ethics model. Quiet CEO, loud reforms. The Malik Carter blueprint. When silence becomes strategy. The flight that changed corporate culture. At a town hall event in Baltimore, a mother of 3 stood up during a local airline panel. "My son's black, he's 14. loves planes. And last year I told him, stay quiet, stay small, don't make a fuss in the air. But now I tell him, if something's wrong, speak and record. Someone will listen. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. A clip of her speech went viral, not for performance, but for resonance. Malik never commented, but he watched the clip from his office, replaying that line twice. Now I tell him, speak. Universities took notice next. 3 top business schools added Flight 227 to their crisis management curriculum, not as a scandal, but as a case study in ethical leadership. Students debated Malik's silence. Was it passivity, or was it the most powerful indictment of all? One professor concluded the lesson by writing on the board, "Power doesn't raise its voice. It builds new systems." In forums across the aviation industry, whistleblowers began to emerge, not always with lawsuits, not always with drama, but with documents, with timelines, with logs. Inspired by the Carter framework, internal staff at 2 other carriers flagged meal preparation inconsistencies. One led to the discovery of an unregulated supplier. Another prompted a federal inspection of catering hygiene standards. Neither incident would have made national news, but both changed policy. Malik's silence had taught them, you don't need noise to be heard. You just need documentation and direction. At a flight academy in Denver, a young woman, first-generation college student training to be a pilot, raised her hand. "Can someone like me change the rules someday?" she asked. The instructor paused, then pointed to the training module playing behind her. A single quote faded onto the screen. One tray, one choice, one industry changed. The girl smiled and for the first time saw herself not as a passenger, but as a pilot of change. Meanwhile, in boardrooms across sectors far from aviation, executives began to ask uncomfortable questions. What are our quiet failures? Who is watching silently? What would happen if one person in the wrong seat had the right power? Compliance consultants started referencing the Malik model. Crisis managers added a new best practice. Don't react to the scream. Prepare for the silence that follows, because now the public knew something the industry had hoped to bury. A change doesn't start in the media. It starts in the moments no one else sees and someone chooses to see anyway. It started with an internal memo leaked from a rival airline. Subject line: operational integrity review. Response to Falconer ethics model. Within hours, a flurry of messages flooded aviation group chats. Compliance officers exchanged glances in hushed break rooms. Training managers checked timestamps on old incident reports. And somewhere inside the industry's hushed corridors, a truth began to settle in. This wasn't just a Falconer problem. This was an aviation culture problem. And now it was everyone's. In London, the British Civil Aviation Authority launched a surprise audit of 5 major carriers. Though no direct mention of Flight 227 was made, the criteria mirrored Zephyr's revised protocol structure down to the language. Pattern mapping of unresolved complaints. Cross-checking catering anomalies with demographic service logs. Behavioral response timelines of crew during ethical incidents. Across Europe, murmurs grew louder. In Frankfurt, a pilot training consortium added a new elective, power prejudice, and passenger protocol, taught by a rotating panel of international ethics consultants, one of whom used to work on the compliance team that reviewed Malik Carter's silent escalation. In Singapore, a private airline rewrote its pre-flight service script to include the following clause: "We honor dignity not by declaring it, but by preparing for it." It was posted inside every crew break room. The crew noticed, so did the passengers. Back in the U.S., the National Aviation Reform Coalition, NARC, convened for an unscheduled ethics summit. The theme wasn't announced until the morning of the event. On every placard, one phrase: respect to serve first. They hadn't asked Malik Carter to attend. He did anyway. Not to speak, to listen. At the summit, panels dissected the policy framework behind the Carter Standard. Airline executives swapped stories not of innovation, but of ignored warnings, moments when someone had flagged something but no one had followed through. A Southwest director stood during a Q&A. "We always train for hijackings," he said, "but we never train for humiliation." A hush followed. That line would go viral the next morning. In Tokyo, a mid-tier airline known for its efficiency but criticized for lack of diversity, sent its entire senior HR staff to study Falcon Eyre's retraining modules. They returned with 183 pages of notes and a letter addressed to Malik Carter. It read, "Your silence taught us more than 1,000 DEI workshops. Thank you for modeling what it means to recalibrate without revenge." Malik never replied, but the letter was framed in his private office. At Zephyr's ethics division, now branded as Z-Aero, the requests came in daily. Aviation schools asking for module licenses, airlines seeking consultant placements, government bodies requesting data sets for legislation. What began as a quiet rebuild inside one airline had now become a template for an entire sector. Malik's strategy team began a white paper titled Post-Conflict Culture Engineering, What Flight 227 Revealed. It didn't open with legal language. It opened with a story. He asked for a vegetarian meal. What he received triggered a systemic correction. Not because he shouted, because he documented, because he understood that systems do not change by outrage. They change by design. In private meetings, unions began asking new questions. Do our protections allow misconduct to hide? What if the next Trent Marlowe works for us? Some resisted the reforms, but others, particularly younger crew members, demanded them. They had seen what happened when one person pressed record instead of pressing back. They had seen what quiet dignity could unearth, and they weren't going back. Malik watched it all unfold from a distance. He didn't control the wave, he just redirected it. That had always been his intention, not to punish one airline, but to vaccinate an entire industry, to install a mindset that outlived the moment, to raise questions in every cockpit, every break room, every board meeting. Would this hold up under the Carter lens? Because that was the real reform, not compliance, consciousness. Somewhere in Phoenix, a young flight instructor updated her classroom presentation for the new semester. Her students, first-time trainees, read over the new opening slide. A single sentence: power is not who gives the order. Power is who rewrites the manual when the system fails. And then came the photo. Not of Malik, not of Devin, just a tray. White ceramic, perfectly still, unforgettable. The final report landed on Malik Carter's desk at 7:14 a.m. No cover letter, no commentary, just a black folder marked 227, final, trace complete. Inside, the truth waited. It wasn't new to Malik. He'd known pieces of it, suspected most of it. But now every detail was mapped, irrefutable, time-stamped, signed by 3 independent compliance investigators and 1 former federal inspector. He read it once without blinking, then again slower, and finally he closed the file, exhaled through his nose, and said quietly, "Now it's over." The document revealed what no public statement had yet confirmed. Trent Marlowe hadn't acted alone. An internal communication string recovered from Falcon Eyre's archived Slack server showed that 4 other employees had access to the catering manifest that flagged Tray 3 before the flight ever boarded. One, an assistant provisioning supervisor, had left a comment, "Let's see how the tech king likes the VIP option today." Another, from a senior flight planner, "If it gets flagged, call it a restocking error. Carter's used to getting special treatment. Time he saw what the rest of us get." Malik had suspected something deeper than personal vengeance. Now he had proof: coordinated resentment. And behind it all, a string of older memos, long forgotten, revealed a disturbing pattern. In 2018, after Zephyr acquired a media startup once affiliated with Falcon Eyre's in-flight content division, 12 employees were laid off. Several had relatives in crew logistics and operations. And though Malik had never personally signed off on any of those changes, his name had been attached publicly, visibly permanently. For 5 years, that resentment fermented quietly in break rooms and group chats, until Flight 227 gave them an opportunity, not for justice, for revenge masked as service. Malik didn't respond with lawsuits. He responded with documentation. The file was sent encrypted and sealed to 3 places: Falcon Eyre's full executive board, the FAA's Ethical Aviation Watch Unit, and quietly to a documentary team that had been compiling a long-form expose on industry silence. The final episode had already been written. Now it needed rewriting. 2 weeks later, the documentary aired. Title One Tray, One Truth What Power Refused to Hide. The final 20 minutes revealed everything: the Slack logs, the emoji, the conspiracy masked by uniforms, and the system that let it happen not from malice but from neglect. The episode didn't call for outrage. It called for vigilance. And across living rooms, boardrooms, training halls, and classrooms, people sat in stillness. Not in disbelief, in recognition. Because this wasn't a single moment of prejudice. It was what happened when no one was watching and everyone assumed they were safe. The backlash was immediate. Not against Malik, against the system. 3 Falcon Eyre managers resigned within 48 hours. 2 others were reassigned pending review. Internal whistleblower protections were overhauled, and most telling of all, a new clause was added to the Carter Standard. Where collaborative misconduct occurs, responsibility is shared not only by those who acted, but those who knew and did nothing. In a quiet interview room, Trent Marlowe was asked if he wanted to make a final statement now that the full truth had emerged. He declined. But when the interviewer asked if he regretted it, the tray, the moment, the smirk, he paused, then said, "I thought he wouldn't notice. I thought he'd just take the insult and stay quiet. I didn't realize his silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy." That night, Malik walked through the nearly empty halls of Zephyr's ethics division. Most staff had gone home. The light in his office was still on. Inside, a single photo lay on his desk. It wasn't of the tray, or the plane, or Devon. It was a still from the documentary's final scene, Malik seated, silent, watching. Below it, the narrator's final words echoed faintly on his speakers. "We watched a man choose not to fight fire with fire, but to drown it in process, to hold the system accountable, not with rage, but with rigor." Malik reached for a pen, wrote 3 words beneath the frame: "Now they know." Then he turned off the light and closed the door. There was no celebration, no headlines, no red carpets, no award ceremonies. Just a quiet Wednesday morning at Zephyr headquarters. The air was crisp, the city skyline wrapped in early light, and Malik Carter sat by his office window, not reflecting, not gloating, just observing. The tray that had changed everything wasn't mounted on the wall. It wasn't preserved in a glass case. It had been disposed of within hours of landing. Because Malik never kept symbols of pain, he built systems of prevention. And this morning, the system worked. Across 17 airlines, new reforms had gone live. In South Africa, a flight school taught students how to log silent incidents using the Devon method. In Sao Paulo, a union had just ratified a no-shield clause protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. In Tokyo, an executive training retreat added a session titled "Designing for Dignity." And Malik, he was already reading Phase 3 proposals, because victory for him was never personal. It was procedural. Devon Torres walked onto a training floor packed with new recruits, not just flight attendants, but pilots, dispatchers, service agents. The room quieted as he stepped up. He didn't speak like a leader. He spoke like someone who had once felt helpless and invisible, and then decided not to stay that way. "We're not here to stop problems," he said. "We're here to design better choices." The class nodded, because they knew, because they'd studied his story. Meanwhile, Falcon Eyre's CEO Everett Langston sat before a Senate Oversight Committee. Not to defend, to report. He didn't start with excuses. He started with a quote. You asked what we've changed since Flight 227. My answer is simple. Everything we once thought was unbreakable, we've now restructured to make unrepeatable. A senator leaned forward. Is that because of Mr. Carter? Langston paused. No, it's because of what he refused to say and what we were forced to hear anyway. In a tiny high school auditorium in rural Arkansas, a social studies teacher projected the Flight 227 case onto a whiteboard. Her class 14-year-olds, some restless, some half asleep, looked up as she played the silent clip of Trent setting the tray down. No words, no sound, just a frame frozen on dignity, challenged and dignity held. Then she asked a single question. If this were you, would you respond with fire or with design? One student raised her hand and said softly, I'd document it. Then I'd build a new rule so it never happens again. The teacher smiled. The ripple had reached farther than anyone thought. Malik received no emails that day worth noting, just a short message from Falcon Eyre's ethics team. Thank you for not suing us. Thank you for teaching us. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His inbox was already filled with something better: progress reports, policy drafts, training footage, and one candid photo of a young recruit standing beside a poster that read, "We don't shout, we show, we restructure." That evening, as the office emptied and the skyline dimmed, Malik walked through the darkened halls. He passed the ethics training lab, the strategy war room, the now iconic respect is served first wall. But he paused at a different spot, a narrow hallway rarely used. On its wall, a quiet display had been installed by Devon's team without announcement. It was just one panel, a printed airline boarding pass, Seat 2A, date March 12th, route Ridgemont to Chicago, passenger Carter, M. No explanation, no glass, just pinned to the wall with a note beneath the seat that rewrote the policy manual. Malik stared at it for a long time. Then with a slow nod, he whispered, good. Not because he had won, but because no one else would have to fight the way he did ever again. No trophy would ever capture that moment, but it didn't need to, because Malik Carter's victory was never loud. It was quiet, it was structural, and it was complete. It had been 1 year. No press conference marked the date. No anniversary campaign was launched. No commemorative plaque unveiled in an airport terminal. But across aviation, everything remembered. At Zephyr headquarters, a quiet internal email went out at 6:45 a.m. Subject Flight 227. Status report 1-year review. It didn't speak of trauma, it measured transformation. 17 airlines had adopted the Carter standard. 92% of internal ethics modules created since were built on the Z-Aero framework. Crew accountability reports increased by 46%, but for the first time, fear reports decreased by 81%. That number mattered most, because Malik Carter hadn't just built a legacy of documentation, he had built a culture where people felt safe speaking without fear. A culture where silence no longer protected harm, it protected growth. At Falcon Eyre, a low-key internal summit convened not for executives but for new recruits. No speeches, no honors, just stories. One senior flight attendant stood before the group and told them about the night Flight 227 landed. We didn't know who he was. We thought he'd shout, "Post-Sue, maybe walk away." But he didn't. He stayed, and in doing so made us confront what we'd ignored for too long. Then she pointed to a chair in the front row. Devon Torres stood. He didn't speak like a hero. He spoke like someone who still remembered the way his stomach twisted when he smelled what was on that tray. If I'd said nothing, this program wouldn't exist. So speak, even if your voice shakes, especially when your voice shakes. They applauded, not because they were told to, but because they believed him. At a leadership symposium in New York, a keynote speaker, former FAA ethics director, concluded her talk with a reference no longer needing explanation. Carter didn't just force the industry to change, he forced us to ask a better question. Not who's at fault, but how did the structure allow this to happen? The room of C-level executives and regulators remained silent, not out of guilt, out of understanding. Back at Zephyr, Malik reviewed one final report before heading home. A small regional airline in Canada had just implemented a first flight reflection model for new crew members. After their first full route, staff were required to log 3 observations. 1. A moment of leadership they witnessed. 2. A moment of silence that concerned them. 3. A change they believe the system still needs. The model was already reducing turnover. In the pilot program, 81% of employees said they felt heard in their first 30 days. That was the legacy, not reaction, but infrastructure that welcomes observation and rewards reflection. At home that evening, Malik sat with a cup of jasmine tea and a printed letter. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged in places. The signature was from a name he didn't recognize. But the message was familiar. My name is Aiden. I'm 17. I want to work in aviation. My mom told me about what happened on that plane. She said not all change is loud, that some people just write better rules quietly so others don't have to scream. I want to be one of those people. Malik read it 3 times. He didn't cry, but he closed his eyes and for the first time in months rested. That same week, an independent think tank released a white paper, Dignity by Design, the Carter Framework in the Future of Organizational Ethics. The conclusion stated, when a system fails, it exposes who leads with ego and who leads with endurance. Malik Carter led by rewiring the institution, not the narrative. And in doing so, he made himself unforgettable by refusing to make himself the center. Legacy wasn't a name etched into a wall. It was policy adopted in silence. It was systems that outlast people. It was a young black man once humiliated in seat 2A who never raised his voice but raised a standard no one could lower again. The sky above Ridgemont was unusually clear that morning. Inside a modest auditorium nestled on the edge of the city, students filed in quietly. It was career day at Jefferson Tech Charter, a public school where opportunity came sparingly, but dreams ran loud. They weren't told who the final speaker would be. When he walked in, there was no fanfare, no security detail, no spotlight, just a man in a dark tailored coat, calm steps, and a presence that silenced the room without saying a word. He didn't bring slides. He didn't quote statistics. He simply looked at the students, some in hand-me-down sweaters, others with eyes filled with the tension between hope and history, and said, I'm not here to talk about how I became a CEO. I'm here to talk about what happens when no one else is watching and you decide to do the right thing anyway. A pause. Stillness. A year ago, I sat in seat 2A. I asked for a vegetarian meal. What I got was a message, you don't belong here. What I did in the minutes that followed didn't look powerful, but it was. He told them about Flight 227, not the headlines, not the documentary, just the moment he chose to respond, not with anger, but with architecture. Real power doesn't scream. It builds things no one else sees coming. A student in the second row raised his hand. Were you scared? Malik smiled slightly. Of course, but the right kind of fear reminds you to be careful, not quiet. Another student asked, why didn't you just call them out right there? He nodded slowly. Because calling them out would have fixed a moment, but I wanted to fix the system that allowed it. They wrote that down, not because he asked, because they understood. Later that evening, Malik returned to his office. The light was soft. His desk was clear. Only one item remained, a framed quote, one that had quietly been placed there by Devin after the final review phase of the Carter Standard was completed. We don't need louder leaders. We need deeper ones. Malik stood, looked out across the city, and finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since Flight 227. The system had changed, and this time it wasn't temporary. It was written in policy and procedure and in people. Legacy, Malik had learned, wasn't measured by how many people chanted your name. It was measured by how many followed your principles when you weren't in the room. And now he was no longer needed in every meeting. because his methods had become the method. His silence, once misunderstood as restraint, had become a blueprint. In the end, the story wasn't about dog food. It was about dignity. It wasn't about one flight. It was about every system that quietly makes someone feel small and one person choosing to dismantle it with clarity, not chaos. Malik picked up his coat. No destination, just movement. Because leaders don't stop when they win. They move on to fix the next broken structure no one's seen yet. As he passed his office door, he paused at a wall-mounted screen, looping a quiet clip from Devon's most recent recruit seminar. The younger man stood confidently now, pointing to a diagram of escalation protocol. "We don't wait for injustice to go viral," he said. "We log it. We act. We reform." The room applauded, not loudly, but with conviction. Malik watched for one more moment, then turned off the screen and stepped into the quiet night. He wasn't seeking justice anymore. He had already designed it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.